Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Volodar, where the Russians continue storming the city itself. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the eastern outskirts of the city. At the same time, they continue pushing on the western flank of it, connecting the northern parts of Pavlivka with their assault from the west. They're now fighting over the fortified positions west of Volodar and are trying to gain control over the road physically here to the southwest of Volodar, but the objective is to reach the southern outskirts of Volodar and fight over that part of the city, as well as gain control over the fortified positions west of Volodar to gain full control over one of the remaining supply roads in and out of the city. The other remaining supply road is this one just north of it, connected towards Bohoyavlinka, which is another road which is under direct fire control of the Russian army. We see here in the eastern parts of Volodar, the Russians have started to gain control over the first high-rise apartment complex buildings, which is some of the buildings really in Volodar. Almost every single one of the buildings is one of these high-rise apartment complex buildings, and it's already located on the high ground. This just shows exactly how much of a fortress a city Volodar is. The fact that the Ukrainians are able to take advantage of the high ground and have these high-rise apartment complex buildings where they can rest on top of to overlook the fields surrounding the city allows them to have direct fire control over the nearby area. But now that the Russians have gained a foothold within it and are starting to occupy the first buildings, it is likely that this situation is irreversible and that the Russians will take control over Volodar with this offensive. The foothold is just the first of many battles that will take place over the capture of Volodar, because so far the withdrawal from Volodar of the Ukrainians is a very slow process, as they send small groups that are attempting to not be detected during their withdrawal. Other than that, the majority of the forces are still within the city itself, fighting against the Russian advance. So we're seeing heavy fighting taking place here in the Volodar section of the front line, as it reaches a very decisive moment. Further north here in the direction of the Kurhova section of the front line, the Russians have managed to capture the village of Shelane Druhe here to the south of Shelane Pershe. There is the Shelane 1st and 2nd. With this, the Russians have cut off yet another road here between the eastern and western parts, where they have managed to cut off the road the Ukrainians have available between Krasnoarivka and Shelane Druhe to then go on towards Hirnik. This means that the current forces of the Ukrainians who are still located here within this pocket have to go through the southern flank and up towards Soriane, down to Alexandropol, also Rysyane, to then pass over to the western bank of the river line. The Russians continue their attempts to cut off the Ukrainian forces. They now are moving on towards Soriane, where the objective is to capture this small part of Soriane on the eastern bank of the river line, where the objective is simply to gain control over this, thereby the crossing, and prevent any remaining Ukrainian soldiers from withdrawing. This means that this entire area will fall under Russian control fairly soon, due to the Russians being so close to cutting it off completely, which would speed up any sort of withdrawals the Ukrainians are committing to here from this pocket. Further west, the Russians have started attacking the town of Zukharine here to the west of Ukrainsk. They've managed to capture the fortified positions here north of Zukharine and gain a foothold within the railways. They will now start advancing along the railways in the southern direction towards Zukharine, where they'll be storming the town, and in the northern direction they will be advancing along the railways to flank the southern flank of Seledove. The Russian advance here near Zukharine by the railways has been geolocated with this footage here. The current fighting here near Zukharine is situated around these two areas. There is this industrial zone to the southeast of Zukharine, and then there's the town itself. The objective of the Russians is to advance here along the northern flank of Hirnik to storm this industrial area. And as a general rule here in the war in Ukraine, any industrial area and any high-rise apartment complex area are considered fortresses in this war in Ukraine. And if we take a look at it, we have the industrial zone here northwest of Hirnik. We have the high-rise apartment complex area here in the central parts, eastern parts of Hirnik. But other than that, the Ukrainians do not have any significant fortified positions within Sukhorina itself, and it is at a intersection between the railways going towards Kurakhove and towards Hirnik. The objective of the Russians here would be to prioritize the capture of Sukhorina and then force their way into the industrial zone from 3 separate directions to cut off the connection between Sukhorina and Hirnik and to flank Hirnik from the west towards Novoselidivka and Ismailivka. At the same time, it will be to advance along the western railway towards Kremenna-Belka and Voznesenka, and as we can see, the Ukrainians do not have any significant positions here along the railways. There is the town of Sukhorina, the villages of Kremenna-Belka, Voznesenka, and then all the way down south near the Vovcha River, there's Bereztsky. There is Novoselidivka here to the south of Sukhorina, and generally capturing 1, 2, 3, 4 villages, as well as Sukhorina, will allow the Russians to connect the western flank, and all of these villages and towns are hardly fortified. This means that this is one of the main targets of the Russians to simply gain control over the western flank, and this will expand the encirclement, not just include this area here to the east, but also includes towns such as Hirnik, Kurakhivka, and so on. This means the fighting towards Hirnik is not an objective to take control over the town, but instead to prevent a Ukrainian withdrawal from the area and simply hit their connection here to the west. With the control over the railways near Sukhorina, the Russians will now focus on getting rid of the remaining routes out of this pocket and create a massive pocket here on the western parts, where the objective is to reach the Vovcha River line and cut off any escape for the Ukrainian soldiers. The escape to the south has also already been cut off near Hostre, with the Russian control over the prison area and Hostre itself. This has cut off any escape here from the southern direction towards Kurakhove, and with this assault towards Sukhorina, we are now seeing the fighting taking place to expand and create a second pocket. Generally, the most critical section of the front line in the Donetsk region for the Ukrainians is this area from Selidove and all the way down south towards the border with Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. We see this based on the fact that there are 3 main defensive positions of the Ukrainians. There's Volodar, there's Kurakhove, and there's Velika Novosilka. 2 of these are facing significant battles, and one of them is directly being stormed from multiple directions. Further north here in the direction of Pishane, the Russians are advancing further south here. It is likely that they are expanding their zone of control to gain control over these roads connecting between Pishane and Krylyakivka, where the objective is to storm Krylyakivka further in the future. The Ukrainians launched a counter-tank recently, which could mean that they are attempting to cut off this road here further south, while the Russians are focusing on expanding any sort of main road that they can get access to. This is likely due to the fact that we are already 3 weeks into the fall season, and they are worried about the weather deteriorating. As soon as the heavy rain starts falling, they'll need some roads to have some sort of connection. But to have a proper connection, they would need to gain control over this road here between Berestove and down south of Pishane. So it is unlikely that the Russians will start storming any of these towns along the eastern bank of the Oska River line until they gain control over this area between Berestove and the front line. However, so far there's no indication of rainy weather starting anytime soon. It will likely be deeper into the fall season that we see such developments. Finally, in the Kursk section of the front line, there's no reports on the main section of the front line. This is likely due to how critical this situation is. Both sides are committing a lot of their forces to the fighting, but this also creates a more of a stalemate situation, as the Russians started their counteroffensive with a lack of soldiers. They have fewer soldiers in the section of the front line than the Ukrainians do. And in comparison, the Ukrainians also started their own offensive operations to hit the rear of the Russians, which again limits their ability to commit to their offensive operations. The Ukrainians managed to advance here and gain a foothold in the southern parts of Veseloa, eastern parts of Obuchovka, as we see with the geolocated footage. The Ukrainians continued their counter offensive, where the objective is to reach Pushkovo and cut off the supplies of the Russians during their counteroffensive here further east, where their objective is to gain control over Svetlikovo and then push towards Sucha. And just to give a proper visualization of the situation near Sucha, the Ukrainians have one main supply line that goes from Sumy towards Sucha. This then expands into multiple directions along these roads like Svetlikovo, up towards Ulgovka in the northern direction, the eastern direction, and so on. All of these areas are supplied through Sucha. If this road is cut by the Russians taking control over Svetlikovo, cutting off this part of the road, and then moving into the core of Sucha, where they can cut off this road, which will then cut off the remaining roads, that is the sort of encirclement situation I talk about. Other than that, there would only be off-road areas. There's no real roads in these directions. This one, for example, it drives all the way up to the east and then towards the river line. And this general area here to the south of Sucha is a marshland. This means that as soon as the rain starts falling, this area will be very difficult to traverse through, especially to establish supply lines. This means that generally, if the weather deteriorates, just cutting off this singular road could significantly limit the supplies of the Ukrainians, and it will be an operational encirclement, not a physical encirclement of the entire area, but there will be no alternate routes in and out of the area, so it can also be considered a proper encirclement unless you traverse through foot through a marshland, which we have seen with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, where he ended up losing one of his eyes and several of his men to the seas. And, well, generally, marshlands are not meant to be traversed by humans, and continuing an offensive where they're supplying thousands of soldiers through marshlands is simply not a smart idea. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.